Hello, my name is Satvik Sharma, and the research project I completed was the analysis of genes involved in DNA damage and DNA damage repair and their role in breast cancer. I chose to do this project because breast cancer is a major health problem, and I believe that studying mutations which occur in our genes that can lead to cancer would allow me to find new patterns and new information that can be useful in the future. In order to complete this project, I used datasets found on ClinVar, and I studied breast cancer with benign and pathogenic sets, and I used a Panther overrepresentation test to determine whether specific DNA biological processes were over or underrepresented in datasets, and this gave me a good idea of which genes were or which processes were related to breast cancer. And in my results, I was able to find out that BRCA1 and BRCA2 are the most impactful, while BRCA1 results in protein changes more frequently than BRCA2, and DNA repair is overrepresented 23.8 times as much as expected compared to normal breast cancer-related genes. And I believe that this is a stepping stone for future research projects on specific understudied genes, such as MLH1 and MSH2.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Samiksha Sriram. I worked on this project with my mentor, Amelia Dickens. The basic premise of the project is to assess whether or not Google Trends can predict an increase in the incidence of new active cases across the United States. Norovirus is a serious gastrointestinal disease or illness that affects over 2,500 Americans annually, so tracking this illness through various methods prevents more people from getting sick. We ultimately hypothesized that the data from the analytical tool Google Trends can in fact predict the number of cases that will be reported in the future in the United States that occur from November 2018 to April 2019. In doing this project, we had to set a few limitations. The first limitation was setting the location parameter to only the United States. We chose to do this because the incidence of norovirus is quite small. Therefore, by using a larger region, such as a country, it may yield more accurate results since there will be more data points to use. We also chose to only look at the dates between November 2018 and April 2019 because wintertime is when the most norovirus cases are prevalent during the year. And of course, this is only in respect to the northern hemisphere because, that's when November to April is kind of like our winter time. And then furthermore, we chose not to use dates prior to this because the CDC data was not well documented. And then after this, it was affected by COVID. That being said, this study utilized the CDC Neurostat data, and it's called NORS, which is the National Outbreak Reporting System, to present the case data and Google Trends throughout the US. Based on the common terms and symptoms associated with this virus, the search terms that we picked were diarrhea, body aches, headaches, norovirus, fever, nausea, vomiting, cruise ships, and gastroenteritis. I plotted the search term data against the CDC data and created a regression model as well as a correlation model. The results from this project showed that the CDC data graph had a similar shape to the graph of the search term. And the search term is vomiting, and that is seen on graph F, figure 1. The correlation coefficient of vomiting against the CDC data was 0.52, but the highest correlations were between body aches and gastroenteritis because the CDC data, against the CDC data, which was 0.63 for both of those search terms. As I mentioned earlier, we created a regression model. This model was used to determine the best line to match to the given CDC data, test how well the Google Trends terms actually predict the variable needed, and assess whether the model has significant predictive power. The significance F was 0.0431, which is less than the allowed uncertainty, and the allowed uncertainty that we chose was alpha is less than 0.05. This indicates that the model is significant. The coefficient of the determination yield, the coefficient of determination yielded a result of 0.618, meaning that 61.82% of the variability in norovirus cases could be predicted based on the search terms. The standard error shows that the predicted cases from the models would fall an average of 14.72 cases away from the real number. From this, we came to the conclusion that our hypothesis was supported, since the results show that the data can supplement in predicting future cases. A way this project could be improved upon is by using Twitter data in the future to estimate an increase in the incidences.
Thank you so much, Samiksha.
All right. Hey guys, my name is Youssef Abdelhalim, and just a little bit about me. I'm from Hillsborough High School, and I am now studying mechanical engineering at Northwestern University in Chicago. Actually in my dorm room right now. And this is a project that I've been working on for the past year now. It's called AutoMelter, and it's a device that I built with my mentor. So before I get to talk about what it is, I'll first talk about why it even is important and what the problem is in the first place. So after there's this, I'm from New Jersey, so there happens a lot of snowstorms there. And after snowstorms, there are 3 options to clear snow off your driveway, which is shoveling, electric snow plows, or having a heated driveway. And I personally didn't have an electric snow plow or a heated driveway, so I had to shovel snow off on my own, and it was really tedious. I didn't like it. So basically, shoveling snow was cost efficient, but it was time consuming and really tiresome. Having an electric snow plow, on the other hand, was super time efficient, but it was really expensive. Snow plows start at around $4,000, and I didn't have the money to buy that. And the last option is having a heated driveway, which is super time efficient, but again, super expensive, and it's really hard to fix if it breaks because it's installed under your driveway. Now, my device that I invented fixes all of these issues because it works automatically, or you can use it manually through a push of the button on your phone, and it costs only $200. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds, where it's automatic, but it's also cheap. So this is what the driveway model looks like, and I'll get into how it works specifically later on in the presentation. But basically, this is a tank that has a specific solution, and when the sensor senses that there's snow outside, the solution would flow into this tube and then into these 2 pipes, and these pipes have holes that are facing this way, and the solution would basically flow onto the driveway, and this solution prevents the snow from sticking on the driveway in the first place. Now, there's another reason why AutoMelter is a pretty cool device. So according to the U.S. Department of Transport, there has been around 2,000 deaths and 140,000 injuries every year due to icy or snowy roads. Now, if you guys live in snowy areas, you know gritters, or like snow salt trucks. It's basically trucks that spray salt on the streets after snowstorms to prevent snow from melting and forming into ice. Now, these devices are really inefficient. First of all, because they were designed in the 1940s and they were never updated ever since. They cost around $100,000 each, and they're used seasonally. And they release a lot of greenhouse gases because they have a lot of devices mounted onto the vehicle. So there's a lot of machines working simultaneously, and yeah, it's just a really inefficient device. Now, another thing about the way gritters function is they start moving after snowstorms start. AutoMelter, the way it works is it will clear snow off simultaneously as it starts, not sequentially. And this would be helpful because you wouldn't have to wait for the snow to stick to the road for the gritters to go out and clear it. It just does it as the snow falls, right from when it starts. Now, this is kind of a model that I drew. I'm not the best artist out there, but this is kind of a model of what it would look like if you tried to put it on the street. So you would have a water tower that has the solution inside of it, and it would work the same exact way that a water tower works. It would be somewhere up high, and the solution would flow down the tubes and would go down pipes along the sides of the road that kind of look like the first model, but the holes would be facing the street from either side, and the solution would be just getting pumped into the street, and that would prevent snow from sticking onto the road in the first place, and thus decreasing the death and injuries that happen due to icy roads. So now let me get into how the device itself actually works. So there are two sensors on the device. So there's a temperature sensor and the precipitate sensor, and they both work simultaneously to sense the presence of snow. So whenever it is less than 0 degrees Celsius, and whenever the precipitate sensor senses that there's precipitate out there, then that means that there's snow. And if there's snow, that the signal is sent to the Arduino. An Arduino is basically a small chip that functions as a small computer, basically. And that Arduino opens the electric valve that's on the tank, and that lets the solution flow outside of the tank. And the valve is connected to a T-shaped pipe that has holes on it, as I mentioned before, and this lets the solution flow onto the driver or onto the streets. And when I was building this, I divided the project into 4 subsections. So there's the electronics part, there's the coding, and there's the physical build and the mobile app. So the first part is the electronics. Now this is what I started out with, and this is basically this. Can you guys see my cursor? I'm not sure. But this is basically the Arduino over here. And this is the breadboard that connects all the wires together to the Arduino and the relay module. These two over here, these are relay modules, and a relay module is basically an on-off switch. So whenever the Arduino sends a signal to the relay module to turn on or off the valve, that's basically the on-off switch that turned or on or off the valve. And this over here is a precipitate sensor. This is the temperature sensor, and this is a water heater to keep the water to keep the solution that's inside the tank heated all the time. This also makes the whole process a lot easier because it would drop the freezing point of the solution. Now this is what the code looks like. I will explain it more in flowcharts because it's easier to do it that way. So this first flowchart explains how the water boiler works or the water heater works. So if I choose to turn the water heater on from my mobile app, then it will turn the water heater on instantly. And if I choose to turn it off, it will turn the water heater off instantly. Now I can choose to do this the automatic way, which is there's the water temperature sensor. And if the water temperature is less than 0 degrees Celsius, then that will turn the water heater on. But if it's more than 0 degrees Celsius, it will turn it off. And I also have an upper bound, so the water doesn't get way too hot. So if the water temperature is more than 20 degrees Celsius, it will turn the heater off. And if it's not, then it will turn it on. Now, you can either choose to do the automatic or the manual way. Both of them work perfectly. There's another flowchart here. There's one where this one is for the valve and how the valve works. So you need the air temperature and the precipitate sensor to both say that there's snow outside, and that will turn the valve on. Or if none of these two conditions are met, the valve will be turned off. And you can also choose to do the manual way using the mobile app. So if it says yes, if you choose to turn the valve on from your mobile app, it will turn the valve on instantly. If you choose not to, then it will turn it off instantly as well.
Youssef, there are just maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. So if you could summarize, that would be wonderful.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is basically the last slide over here. So yeah, this is the physical build. I showed this earlier in the slide. So this is the electric valve. These are the width of the holes. And yeah, this is the physical build. And this is basically the mobile app. It's super straightforward. This is the Wi-Fi module. You connect this to the Arduino. It allows you to connect the Arduino to your phone. And you just use this mobile app to basically do whatever, to control the device however you want. It's super simple and super straightforward. Yep, that's all I had. Thank you so much.
So
I'm ready. So, hello, I am Ojasvi Mudda, a high school sophomore. Today, I will be presenting the research I did with my mentor Ellie about the expression of complement system genes across the subtypes of glioma, a malignant brain cancer. So today, I will go over the background of my research, the methods, the results, and the discussion. So first off, this is the background of my research. Glioma. Gliomas are a malignant and poorly understood cancer that occurs in the glial cells of the brain and is associated with poor prognosis. It is characterized by high levels of tumor heterogeneity, making treatment difficult. Gliomas are divided up into different subtypes based on clinical factors and mutational signature analysis. First of all, gliomas are divided into two clinically defined subtypes, lower-grade glioma and glioblastoma, which differ in aggressiveness and metastatic stage. Gliomas are also divided into four transcriptional subtypes defined by gene expression: proneural, neural, mesenchymal, and classical. These subtypes vary in histology, survival, and response to intense treatment. Finally, gliomas are also divided into two mutational subtypes based on their IDH mutation status. IDH mutant has the mutation in the IDH gene, where IDH wild type doesn't have the mutation. IDH wild type is associated with a poorer prognosis compared with IDH mutant. I'll now be moving on to the next branch of my research, the complement system. The complement system is a branch of the immune system involved in many critical immune functions, including optimization, inflammation, and the killing of pathogens. The complement system can also be considered a double-edged sword. Recent research has shown it to have a pro-tumor role in maintaining metastasis, immunosuppression, and was associated with a negative impact on treatment. So we wanted to find out whether the difference in outcome between the different subtypes and grades of glioma is correlated with the aberrant expression of complement system gene. I will now go over the methods that I used to answer my research question. RNA-seq data was collected from the TCGA database and compiled into a summarized experiment. To analyze this data, R, a statistical programming language, and bioconductor packages were used in order to perform the analysis. Bioconductor, an open source repository, has many R packages dedicated towards analysis of genomics data. The packages used for this analysis are the DSIC2 package, which is used for differential gene expression analysis, the FeedBat package, the FJCA package, and the SAMR package, which is used for outcome analysis. This is the workflow used. So RNA-seq data was transformed to a summarized experiment. DSIC2 analysis followed, and the resultant DSIC2 object was used to produce a heat map with expression values of complement system genes, and was also used to perform gene set enrichment analysis. The summarized experiment is also used to perform outcome analysis correlating expression of complement system genes with prognosis using SAM-seq. Now I'll be presenting the results that I got from DSIC2, heat maps, GSAA, and SAMR. This is the next two slides are the slides with the DSIC2 results. This is the result of the DSIC2 analysis, which produces a MA plot that shows the differential expression of complement system genes across the two subtypes. Overexpressed genes are above the x-axis, and underexpressed genes are below the x-axis. On this slide, the transcriptional subtypes were compared with complement system gene expression for the classical subtype, as the classical subtype is the most similar in presentation to normal gliomas. There were 67 genes differentially expressed across the proneural and classical subtypes, 27 genes differentially expressed across the neural versus classical subtypes, and 107 genes differentially expressed across the mesenchymal subtype. On this slide, complement system gene expression was compared across IDH wild type versus IDH mutant in the two clinical subtypes of glioma, lower-grade glioma and glioblastoma. In low-grade glioma, 33 genes were differentially expressed, while in glioblastoma, 21 genes were differentially expressed. The following two slides show the heat map generated with the gene expression data from the DSIC2 package. Hierarchical clustering was performed based on the sample similarity. The heat map was then annotated with IDH mutation status, transcriptome subtype, survival in months, vital status, and Karnofsky performance score to determine if the expression of complement system genes are a supervising factor for glioma subtypes. In glioblastoma, clustering is observed with the transcriptional subtypes of 3 clusters. a proneural cluster, a classical cluster, and a mesenchymal cluster. The heat map generated for lower grade glioma also shows clustering with the transcriptional subtypes with 3 clusters. The proneural cluster, the classical cluster, and the mesenchymal cluster. This analysis shows that the expression of complement system genes partially supervises the clustering of glioma samples, which further supports our analysis. GSEA analysis was performed to create a pathway enrichment graph comparing enrichment in the complement system pathway across the different subtypes. Overall, the complement system was the 11th most enriched pathway in both low-grade glioma and glioblastoma. This slide shows the pathway enrichment across the transcriptional subtypes in glioblastoma with an overall positive enrichment. The mesenchymal subtype is noted to have the most enrichment out of the subtypes. These graphs compare the enrichment across IDH mutant versus wild type in both glioblastoma and low-grade glioma. There is negative enrichment across IDH mutant versus wild type in both clinical subtypes. SAM-seq analysis was then performed, which generated the complement system genes associated with worse prognosis. Overall, in glioblastoma, 25 genes were associated with worse prognosis. Across the transcriptional subtypes, 27 genes were associated with worse prognosis in the proneural, 15 genes were associated with worse prognosis in neural, 4 genes were associated with a better prognosis in mesenchymal, and in the classical subtype, 22 genes were associated with a better prognosis. Analysis across the IDH mutational subtypes in glioblastoma are shown. In IDH wild type and mutant, 62 genes were associated with worse prognosis. In low-grade glioma overall, 55 genes were associated with worse prognosis. Analysis across the IDH mutational subtypes in low-grade glioma are shown below. In IDH wild type, 76 genes were associated with worse prognosis compared with IDH mutant, where only 18 genes were associated with worse prognosis. Overall, complement system genes are differentially expressed across subtypes and can be associated with poor prognosis. The expression varies across the subtypes. The proneural subtype had the most genes associated with poor prognosis, while the mesenchymal subtype had the most genes differentially expressed overall with the highest pathway enrichment score, but with a less clear correlation with outcome. This could potentially indicate a correlation between complement system gene expression and the proneural mesenchymal transition associated with recurrency, metastasis, and poor prognosis in gliomas. In the mutational subtypes, IDH wild type overall have the most expression of complement system genes versus the mutant. Discussion. Here are the implications from my research. This suggests that aberrant complement system gene expression can be associated with the varying phenotypes, prognosis, and reactions to aggressive treatment amongst the different subtypes of glioma. This can also lead to further insights on interactions between the complement system and tumor metastasis, which can lead to possible actionable targets for treatments. Further research can investigate the potential link between the complement system and metastasis. Wet lab research can also be conducted targeting specific complement system genes to determine potential actionable treatment targets. I would like to thank my mentor, Ellie, for her support and guidance throughout this project. And I would also like to thank Polygence for giving me this opportunity to conduct research. Here are my references. And thank you all for attending this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm now open for questions.
Okay, so this is my presentation. I hope you're having a great day, and it's basically going to be a breakdown of how art and literature were interconnected to the revolutionary ideology of the Arab Spring that caught the whole world's attention in the early 2010s. And it's also going to be expanding on how art and literature can become the epicenter of a revolution overall. Okay, so a few questions. What does art have to do with politics? What does Taylor Swift have to do with this presentation? Well, art and politics have been intertwined for hundreds of years. Michelangelo used his sculptures to articulate his own belief of the interconnectedness of religion and politics and citizenship. And in the modern day, we have artists like Taylor Swift using their music to articulate their own political beliefs as well. This photo is from the You Need to Calm Down music video in which she advocates for LGBTQ rights, for instance. The question then is not whether art has a connection with politics, but how they manage to influence politics overall. We will be looking at the Arab Spring and specifically Egypt and Syria to observe this phenomena and answer this question. Okay, so why are we looking at Egypt and Syria in particular? The Egyptian and Syrian revolutions are two instances in which revolutionaries have not yet succeeded in achieving their end goals. For Egypt,
apologies, Geetika. I don't mean to interrupt, but your screen is paused on your first slide, and we haven't seen when you've changed your slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this happened to someone else in like a presentation that I was in as well.
No worries. You might just have to try sharing your screen again.
Okay. Okay, so you can see this, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
If you click present, now we can see your first page.
Okay.
And should be all good.
Okay, so I just switched to another slide. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, this was my second slide. This is the picture that I was referring to. But now we're on this one. So can you see the image of the protesters? Can you see the third slide?
Yep.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, awesome. So as I was saying, the Egyptian and Syrian revolutions are two instances in which the revolutionaries have not yet succeeded in achieving their end goals. And for Egypt, this means that despite two new presidents stepping in after Hosni Mubarak, who was in control from 1981 to 2011, the government still remains a military dictatorship, which is what the protesters were trying to end. Meanwhile, the Syrian people have not yet seen the resignation of their president Bashar al-Assad that they were protesting in the first place. So today we will be observing how art can benefit the revolutionaries and how it interacts on the local sphere, as well as how it's received on a local and international space. On a local level, this art has two functions, to heal and to satirize. We will first be looking at how revolutionary art can serve as a vehicle for healing and trauma. So the two novels we will be looking at to discuss this are That Smell by Sonali Ibrahim, published in 1996, which uses unembellished and crude narration to describe a former political prisoner's inability to interact with the external world due to the internal conflicts and PTSD that stem from his time in prison. Meanwhile, the second one, called The Frightened Ones, written by Dima Wanous, which is pictured here, is rife with emotion, specifically fear, as the author describes the crippling fear that can arise after living in an oppressive government. Both novels can be seen as an attempt for the authors to heal themselves and process their own trauma, as they both experiences similar to those characters in their novels. As we know, art therapy is pretty common as a healing method for those who have undergone traumatic experiences. However, it can also be so healing for the reader as well. There's something kind of beautiful almost in bringing this kind of trauma to light, however twisted it may seem initially. For instance, That Smell was heavily criticized and even banned when it was first released due to its aforementioned crudeness. However, it has grown to be recognized as a seminal piece of literature for its honest portrayal of trauma. The act of bringing such a painful experience to light, to allow people to recognize their own pain within these characters and to be able to see that they're not alone, is an immensely cathartic experience. Now, the next way that art interacts with the revolutionaries themselves is by satirizing the events of a revolution. This image is a still from the YouTube channel Masasit Mati. Using clownish clay figures to depict their leader Bashar al-Assad and his advisors, the short play portrays the Syrian dictator as a cowardly child, screaming from nightmares that he will be overthrown. His advisors are shown to be pacifying liars who convince him that nothing is wrong with his regime and he's in no danger of being overthrown. Now, from Jonathan Swift to John Oliver, satires have been a tongue-in-cheek method for criticizing the status quo. However, with something as tragic as the Arab Spring, it becomes even more than that. It becomes a tool for the revolutionaries of quiet resistance by turning their oppressors, who have for so long used fear to command respect and obedience within citizens, into laughable cartoons or caricatures. These regimes themselves feel more breakable. The creators of these videos possess the ability to see these imposing figures and turn them into an item of entertainment. They're able to face the horrors that such regimes throw at revolutionaries and innocent civilians and still have the courage and lightheartedness to create something humorous. This is an act of bravery and rebellion within itself, as well as a source of inspiration for other revolutionaries. After all, no one can be that intimidated after watching a video of the tyrannical president of Syria crying like a child over his nightmares. On the other hand, satirical art can also be kind of maudlin. The Q, a 2016 novel by Egyptian author Basma Abdelaziz, is on the other side of the spectrum. I'll try not to spoil it too much because it's a really fascinating read if you want to go ahead and read that. But the novel makes the use of symbolism and allows the reader to make their own connections between the events taking place in the novel and the Egyptian revolution and what came after it. Specifically, Abdelaziz's portrayal of the main character's almost Sisyphean journeys in the face of an autocratic government is a direct parallel to the progression of the Egyptian people's attempts to instill a democratic government of their own. This is something that would be easy for a local reader to understand, but might not be as well received on an international level. This is important because in the making of this parallel, Abdelaziz is alluding to the impossibility of their task in the first place. And in that, she's almost caustically forgiving towards the rebels and preserving their hope and their mistakes for the future generations to learn from. Now, in the international community, art serves to provide a more pedagogical function. It seeks to maximize the audience and bring attention to the cause. Often these works are critically acclaimed. This is the image of Syrian filmmaker Walad Khatiyab, who made the 2019 film For Sama about the Syrian documentary and received a BAFTA for her film. However, they can also draw criticism. We'll be looking at For Sama and another film called The Square, a film that follows a group of Egyptian activists in the month of Egypt's first revolution to observe how revolutionary art specifically affects the international community. The criticisms for these films largely arise from the way they attempt to appeal to the Western world. For instance, The Square has been accused of playing into the one-sided and often polemic portrayal of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Egyptian Revolution. The film's strategic elimination of certain parts of the Egyptian Revolution's timeline allow an unknowing viewer to perhaps believe that the Brotherhood did not sacrifice as much of their time or energy for the revolution and only joined to achieve power for themselves. For Sama faces criticisms for its use of violent imagery to articulate the crisis in Syria. The worry is that the constant onslaught of violence will turn the crisis into a spectacle, that it will nearly desensitize the viewer to the issue. Additionally, the issue of bodily autonomy is also a worry. It would be difficult for both filmmakers to ask permission of every person who appeared in the film for permission to use their image. On the other hand, proponents of maintaining the archive insist in its presence in the digital world and say that it can have a beneficial effect. The presence of the footage minimizes the risk of a repetition of the 1982 massacre in Hama, in which tens of thousands of Syrian citizens were killed, but lack of evidence allowed the Syrian government to easily cover up the tragedy. What's more, these works can bring international attention and provide unfiltered, unbiased footage, which is something that could not have been done in the past. So I would like to end on this incredible quote, which essentially summarizes the importance of art in a revolution. There are, of course, those who believe that the primary function of art should still be in its aesthetic value alone, but that seems to discredit the value which it can have, which we've broken down in these past few slides. It can become the epicenter of a revolutionary story. It can document the wins and losses along the way, and it can be a weapon against an oppressive government or a tool for recovery. In summary, art and literature are invaluable, both for the work they do for the revolutionaries and the stories they preserve for the generations after.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Sabrina Lopez, and I will be presenting an overview of my paper, The Grounds for Regulating Big Tech, an Evaluation of Harm and Responsibility. The digital landscape has evolved. As societal dependence on technology for everyday tasks and services grows, so too does the extent to which we allow technology corporations into our personal lives. Tech companies now require more user data and offer less transparency than ever. Is this for better or for worse? As we all well know, this new dynamic between users and companies creates potential for ethical tensions. For example, from the obscurity of corporate data practices has arisen a data economy, wherein various technology firms, proprietors of apps and websites engage in the trading of accumulated user data, such as user preferences, habits, and demographics with outside vendors. The 5 largest firms involved in the data economy are Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon. They together share a $4 trillion combined market value. The data economy may not be explicitly immoral, but it leaves open great temptation for technology corporations to distribute data to unquestionable or even unsavory vendors. For instance, in 2018, Facebook and political data analysis firm Cambridge Analytica covertly seized huge amounts of user data through misleading third-party apps in order to build psychographic profiles on global electorates. Political campaigns, which rely heavily on demographic ad targeting, utilize these profiling tactics to influence advertising to supporters and opposition alike. Since we know tech corporations are in fact capable of committing harm towards users, this brings us to the central question of my paper. Who can be held morally responsible for the actions of technology corporations? The ambiguous moral status of the corporation extends beyond just technology firms, and in all cases can leave clear who or what should bear responsibility for actions, including harms done by corporations. But in order to answer this question, I must first clarify what I mean by moral responsibility. When one is morally responsible, they are to blame for both the occurrence of an action as well as its moral implications. When one merely causes an action, they are responsible for its occurrence, but not necessarily the moral implications of that action. For example, when you discipline a dog for chewing on the remote, you're not disciplining her for a moral failing. You're correcting her action of causing the event. You've isolated the blame for the cause of an undesired action from the moral responsibility for that action, which the dog in fact committed. You can do this because you know intuitively that the dog lacks the ability to tell right from wrong. So we're able to acknowledge that a harm has been committed without needing a morally responsible party. So now, in order to figure out if technology corporations can be held morally responsible for their actions, we have to first determine whether or not they're a moral agent. A moral agent is a being capable of discerning and acting in accordance with what is known to be right or wrong. As I mentioned in other words earlier, the distinction between a moral agent and a non-moral agent is the ability to be held morally responsible for harmful actions. Because moral agents are aware of harm, they have obligations to not only avoid harm by acting morally, but to hold those who cause harm accountable for the sake of avoiding any future harm. Why is this the case? Well, partially because of our first criteria, which we'll use to determine the moral agency of corporations. Moral judgment is this criteria. It is the capacity to reflect on the moral implications of one's actions and observe these considerations when acting. Moral judgment is what gives moral agents the ability to discern right from wrong. It is the most basic criteria for moral agency. Moral judgment involves reasoning, reflection, and the ability to adapt one's behavior in response to conclusions one draws about what they determine to be a good or a bad action. As I mentioned on the last slide, moral agents have obligations to avoid present and future harms by holding fellow moral agents accountable. They have these obligations because they can each morally judge. It is also for this reason that only moral agents can be held morally responsible for their actions. In reference to the corporation, it cannot experience unified moral judgment because they cannot engage in collective reasoning. What we mean when we say they is the moral agents behind the corporation, the actors whose wills most directly influence the trajectory of that corporation's taken actions. The corporation's controlling members are the ones who ultimately dictate what the corporate entity does. However, these controlling members are not able to collectively engage in reasoning about present and future actions in a way which draws unified moral conclusions. Controlling members can undergo individual reasoning and judgment within themselves, but it is not possible for the collective to be consistent in accurately conveying the scope of this internal reasoning in which they can individually engage. For this reason, it's also idealistic to overestimate the truthfulness of what they'll reveal to one another in this collective reasoning action. This undermines the ubiquitousness of the collective moral conclusion and makes them incomparable to true moral judgment by a moral agent. This means that the corporation does not meet this essential criteria for moral agency. Another criteria in which the corporation falls short of moral agency is through its ability to be intentional. It is stipulated that we can connect the intentional decision-making of a corporation back to its ability to act as a moral collective. I reject this because truly unanimous intentionality between the controlling members of a corporation is not consistent. The presence of unspoken motives and morally incompatible ends ensures that corporations, as a singular entity, are not consistently capable of unified intentionality. If we know that unified intentionality within the corporation is inconsistent and considered corporations moral agents only when we knew that true intentionality was shared between all members, then it would require fellow moral agents interacting with the corporation to allow it adaptive moral agency status, which is practically implausible. So realistically, corporations as an entity meet neither the moral judgment nor the intentionality criteria for moral agency and therefore are not moral agents. So because corporations are not true moral agents, then they cannot be held directly morally responsible for their actions, harmful or otherwise. This is obviously not an intuitive conclusion, as it goes against our impulse to seek responsibility from them for events such as Cambridge Analytica. We know that harms have been done, so surely we feel that there must be a responsible party. Well, corporate entities, though they cannot be held directly responsible for harms themselves, can still carry out harm in virtue of a moral agent, or agents such as controlling members. In this way, corporations are a unique entity, a vicarious agent, or an agent which functions as an extension of a full moral agent, and can carry out morally loaded actions, though it is not a moral agent itself. To better illustrate this concept, let's consider a thought experiment. Consider alien planet P, populated by moral agents, collectively launches an unmanned ship towards Earth with the intention of Earth's annihilation. Once launched, the trajectory of the ship cannot be interfered with. It will collide with Earth as it was intended to. In this case, we notice two important things. Firstly, we notice that the ship, though loaded with immoral intentions, does not satisfy our criteria for moral agency. And secondly, that the Earth is populated in part by humans who are moral agents. This means that humans possess the moral obligation to avoid harm where they interpret it. In this case, the ship, though not a moral agent, poses a direct harm to humans. So the humans of Earth possess an obligation to avoid harm from the ship by defending themselves from its attack. In this case, there also happens to be moral agents behind the ship's actions, the inhabitants of planet P who initially launched the ship, to whom we can trace the responsibility for their vicarious agents' actions. So the humans of Earth have a duty to hold morally responsible those who launched the ship, the members of planet P who are moral agents, and the members of planet P have an obligation to accept that moral responsibility of which their moral failing orchestrated. Therefore, the moral obligations of all agents in this situation remain, even in the presence of a vicarious agent. So in conclusion, technology corporations cannot be held responsible for the harms they commit because they are not moral agents, but rather vicarious agents who lack the ability to bear full moral responsibility. Though because they are vicarious agents, this means that they're controlled by moral agents who do possess this ability. The moral agents, the controlling members of a corporation whose decisions directly influence the trajectory of their vicarious corporate entity's actions, are ultimately morally responsible for those actions. If our thought experiment is true, and if moral agents have a moral obligation to protect themselves from harm and hold those who harm accountable, then when users of technologies who are themselves moral agents are met with the potential to be harmed by the practices of technology companies, they have an obligation to defend themselves from instances of harm from any type of agent. In reality, in practice, this could take many forms, according to the degree of harm experienced by users. In cases where harms committed are found to be unlawful, it could look like the regulation of corporate vicarious entities and the prosecution of controlling moral agents. Regardless, the importance for both users and lawmakers to possess an awareness with whom the responsibility for harms committed against them lies is paramount in seeking retribution for those moral failings, and for having a clear picture of where users' reactive attitudes towards these harms can be directed. Finally, it is in users of all technology's best interest that we remain aware of what information we share, who we share it to, and who's responsible for what happens to it. Thank you all for your time, and special thank you to my mentor, Kevin John, for helping me with this project.
Okay. Hi, my name is Angela, and my Polygence project is titled A Predictive Model of Pediatric Epilepsy from Visually Guided Saccades. So before I start, I just want to share a little bit about me. I live in New York City, but both of my parents are originally from Serbia, and some of my favorite hobbies include Zumba, traveling, and reading. I attend Hunter College High School, and I just started my junior year. And some of my school involvements include being a member of the Girls Who Code Club and a mentor for our writing center. And my project is a combination of computer science with epilepsy, because I've had a long-time interest in computer science, math, and problem solving, and I have a cousin who was diagnosed with epilepsy as a baby. So I came into Polygence wanting to learn more about these two things. I'll start with an introduction to epilepsy and its diagnosis. Epilepsy is a neurological disorder categorized by seizures and abnormal brain activity. Left untreated, it can lead to many complications, including brain damage, reduced quality of life, and sometimes even death. So early and accurate diagnosis is really important. In my project, I referenced two main subtypes of epilepsy, which are chronic or treatment resistant, and controlled, which is treatment responsive. Typical diagnosis of epilepsy includes consultation with the neurologist who performs a few brain scans, the principal one being an electroencephalogram or an EEG. And as you can see in this image, electrodes are strapped to the brain in order to record the epileptiform activity. But there's a few problems with this. Firstly, diagnostic EEGs fail to correctly identify epilepsy in about half of patients. Brain scans can also cost hundreds of dollars, and epilepsy rates are even higher among socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. Finally, as you can see in the image, having electrodes strapped right to your head can cause a lot of discomfort and anxiety, especially for young children, and especially because neuropsychiatric disorders are highly comorbid with epilepsy. So because of this, I wanted to explore a low-cost and non-invasive way of diagnosing epilepsy. So I turned to machine learning based on eye movement data. Saccades are a type of rapid eye movement that abruptly change the point of fixation. So an example is if you're driving the car and then you quickly and accurately look towards a stop sign close in front of you. Previous studies have observed saccadic eye movement abnormalities in children with epilepsy, and saccades have also been used in machine learning predictors for autism, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, all of which are neurological disorders. Based on this, I hypothesized that saccadic eye movement data could be used to predict pediatric epilepsy and subtype. I was able to find an open source data set measuring the saccadic eye movements of healthy children and children with chronic or controlled epilepsy. The cohort consisted of 74 kids, 11 with chronic epilepsy, 15 with controlled, and 48 who were part of an age and sex matched, typically developing population. 74 is a sample size not large enough to train effective machine learning models, but the study conducted 30 pro-saccade trials and 30 anti-saccade trials for each subject. A pro-saccade is when you look towards a new target, and an anti-saccade is when you look away from it. So in this diagram, you can see that the patients looked at a centrally fixated cross for 1 second, and then a green circular target appeared to the right or left. And if it was a pro-saccade task, they had to look quickly and accurately towards the new target. And if it was an anti-saccade, they had to inhibit a pro-saccade towards it and instead look to the opposite side of the screen. So I decided to use each trial as an observational unit for model training, which gave me over 4,000 examples to train the models on. And after data was cleaned and pre-processed, I ended up with 6 predictor variables, all of which were saccadic eye movement parameters, including accuracy and other dynamics. I had 6 candidate model architectures or algorithms for classifying that I trained using 70% of the data and tested using 30%, which is called holdout validation. I selected the best model according to 2 measures of evaluation: accuracy and AUC, or area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. If you plot the false positive rate on the x-axis and the true positive rate on the y-axis at various threshold levels for a machine learning classifier, the area under that curve will represent how good the machine learning model is at identifying the correct classes. So an AUC value of 0 would mean that all the positive classes are being labeled as negative and vice versa, while an AUC value of 1 would mean that all the examples are being put into the correct class. I then calculated the predictor importance estimates, which tell me how much weight the model is assigning to each of the variables. Finally, I performed significance testing to show that the model is significantly above chance. For epilepsy diagnosis, the best model architecture was an ensemble classifier, which achieved an AUC of 0.66 and an accuracy of 67%. As you can see in this image, all the models were well above chance, which is represented by the dashed line, and they all achieved pretty similar performance. For the predictor importance estimates, peak saccade velocity, representing the speed of the saccade, had the highest importance, with saccade amplitude, or distance traveled by the eye, and start time, or time taken to initiate it, shortly behind. And 5 out of 6 of the variables had some importance. For the subtype model, the best architecture was also an ensemble, which achieved an AUC of 0.75 and an accuracy of 72%, outperforming the diagnostic model. Once again, all the models were above chance, but this time the ensemble stands out a little bit more as having the greatest area underneath. For epilepsy subtype, this time there were two methods of calculating the predictor importance because it was a slightly different type of ensemble. But the saccade amplitude, velocity, start time, and duration of the next fixation all had the highest importances, with all the variables having some importance. This suggests that the optimal model for predicting epilepsy and subtype based on eye movement data is an ensemble classifier, and both the models achieved significantly above chance performance. They achieved robust AUCs and high specificities, which means they were good at detecting the negative cases, which would be controlled epilepsy or no epilepsy, but they had lower sensitivities, meaning it was harder to identify the positive cases, which would be epilepsy or chronic epilepsy. This may be because the data set was skewed to include more negative examples, so the models were better trained to identify those. The epilepsy subtype model outperformed the diagnostic model, which may suggest that differences in eye movements between controlled and chronic epilepsy are even more pronounced than those between healthy control and epilepsy of any subtype. But it might also be because the data for the subtype model was a little bit more balanced in terms of class distribution. 100% of the children with epilepsy were correctly identified for at least one trial, which suggests that they present with saccadic abnormalities only some of the time and not ubiquitously. Performing multiple trials could lead to a higher diagnostic accuracy in practice. According to the predictor importance estimates, saccadic parameters like speed and time taken to initiate it are heavily influenced by epilepsy. And all of this suggests that the model can be used as a low-cost and non-invasive supplement to an EEG. And here you can see a little girl using the eye tracking data, and it's so much less invasive than the image of the EEG shown at the beginning. Future directions include external validation or testing this model with a different population, as well as prospective studies or collecting new data to test the model on. A larger cohort size would improve the generalizability of the results. As you can see in this figure, epilepsy also has a lot of comorbidities, including ADHD, depression, anxiety, and more. So a dataset testing the model with non-typically developing control groups would help isolate epilepsy as the sole cause of the abnormalities. Finally, a dataset measuring the eye movements before children were classified as chronic or controlled and treated would help predict treatment response to anti-epileptic drugs in advance. I'd like to end by thanking my wonderful mentor, Olivia, the whole Polygence team, and my family for all their support in this project. And I'd like to thank you all for listening.